Thomas's birthplace, 5 Cwmdonkin tribe. We will be interviewing Professor Daniel Williams.
Here is the birthplace of the literary genius Dylan Thomas. He was born on the 27th of October 1914 and he sadly passed away on the 9th of November 1953.
What's the importance of the Dylan Thomas house?
I think it's the most important house in Dylan's life. And I say that because he lived here for 23 years. He only lived for 39 years, so over half his life he lived here. And in that period he wrote 2/3 of his published work while living in this house. So that's a huge amount of his output. Between the ages of 15 and 19, he was producing work of world-class quality, and it was not only poetry, it was short stories. He had ideas for plays, he had an idea for Underwood Wood, and he discussed that with one of his friends, and he called it The Town That Was Mad. And he'd never left Swansea before that, so Swansea must have been the place he thought was the town that was mad. My favourite room, I think, is Dylan's little bedroom. I think it's a little room that you can see how somebody wants to write in that room, because it's a small room, everything is at hand, so he can lie in bed and he can almost reach his bookshelf and pull a book out, but he probably wouldn't do that because it would be on the floor in front of him anyway. And once he closed the door, it's like a little enclosed cell. And that's somewhere where you can write, nobody's going to disturb you, you're not aware of anybody coming to knock on the front door, and you get on with doing the work. And I think that's what he did from all that time that he lived in this house.
This was Dylan Thomas's bedroom, and he wrote most of his poems here, and there's a picture of him up there. Described it as one of the best rooms in the house. This is Dylan Thomas's sister's room, Nancy's room, and Dylan was sometimes found here writing short poems. Because the heat from the kitchen could rise up and heat the bedroom, so yeah.
What's your favourite poem that Dylan Thomas wrote?
Oh, that's difficult to say. Do Not Go Gentle, I think, is technically the best poem that I've ever read. But it is 19 lines, some of which are repeated, but it tells a story in those 19 lines in very few words that you can get the impression of it. Another poem which is all about this area, it's about Cwmdonkin Park, is Hunchback in the Park. And I think that starts off, Dylan says, the hunchback in the park, a solitary listener. And you immediately have an impression of what that person is. that this man who's an outcast, he's on his own in the park. And that sets the scene for the whole poem. So I think he was very, very good at using very few words to describe lots of things.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. You've been a really good group, and it's been a pleasure to have you here and to explore the birthplace of Dylan Thomas. And I hope you explore much more of his work in the future. Thank you.
My name's Charlie. My name's Owen. And today we are going to explore the Dylan Thomas and the Joe Flipper.
These are the original dolls from Dylan's writing shed. They were saved by the council in the 1970s. Who is responsible for the Dylan Thomas Centre. Why do you think it's important for children to learn about Dylan Thomas?
I think Dylan Thomas is probably one of the most inspiring people to ever come out of Swansea. He started writing poems when he was younger than you, and he went on to be world famous at what he did. He was incredibly talented, and I think he's an amazing example of what people can achieve. They've got talent and they really work hard at it.
How many visitors does the centre get every year?
We get about 130,000 visitors a year, and they come from all over the world as well. So we obviously get lots of groups of young people coming from schools, but we also get people coming from America because they knew about Dylan's lecture tours there. And we get loads of visitors from Europe as well. And we even had someone from Brazil come in. We've had some pretty remote places that people have come from.
As a Dylan Thomas researcher, what's the most fascinating fact you've learned about him and why?
That's a really hard question, actually. Maybe this is one I should have known ahead, actually. Try and pull one out. I suppose one of my best moments in my job was being able to go to America and look at the notebooks he wrote between the ages of 15 and 19. He used to write all his poems in school exercise books because he didn't really do much work at school except for write poems in his exercise books, it sounds like. But I got to see the notebooks and bring them back to Swansea for just a display for everyone to see. And opening up the notebooks for the first time in the preservation conditions at Buffalo in New York was amazing, and you could see all his drawings, his notes, he'd written word lists, you could see very crossed out and rewritten things, little drawings of maids and mice and all kinds of things. And you could see in this first one he's trying out his signature and working out what the best signature a poet should have was, because it was like he was creating an image of himself as a poet even when he was 15, 16 years old. So that's probably one of my best moments, I think.
Dylan Thomas's childhood, and his favourite fruit was oranges.
It's not your orange.
How important is the way that information is presented in the centre?
Oh, we thought a lot about it, and we consulted with lots of people, with people from different schools, people who hadn't been here before, to find out what people would like to see and the best way of accessing information. So we tried to do a mixture of things, as you've seen in there. So we've got information about him, objects that tell you about him, lots of quotes from his work, which we might be able to hear in the background of this recording because someone's playing them, and also some fun interactives as well, just to bring him to life as a person as well as an actor.
What techniques do you use to get more people to visit the centre?
Right, well, we do lots of different marketing things. We've got a lovely marketing officer called Georgia, and we have flyers about the centre. We've got a website, dylanThomas.com, which is the most visited Dylan Thomas website in the world. And we've got all sorts of social media as well, so we've got Twitter, Facebook, we write a blog for our website. But one of the biggest things is still word of mouth. When people come away from here and tell all their friends and family that they've had a good time, and then they come back again.
Why did you choose to research into Dylan Thomas?
Well, I'm originally from Bristol, so I'm not from here, but I came here to go to university, and Dylan Thomas was obviously a massive figure. And I came in to study English at the uni, and I just started to get to know his work. And over the years, I suppose you just find out more and more fascinating things about him and about his writing. And I just really love what he do, so I've got the best job ever, I think.
Thank you very much for your time.
The Hunchback in the Park. The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister, propped between trees and water from the opening of the garden lock that lets trees and water enter until Sunday's sombre bell at dark.
Eating bread from a newspaper, drinking water from the chained cup, that the children filled with gravel, in the fountain bases where I sailed my ship, slept at night in a dog kennel, but nobody chained him up.
Like the park birds he came early, like the water he sat down, and Mister, hey Mister they called, the truant boys from the town, running when he had heard them clearly, on out of sound.
Past lake and rockery, laughing when he shook his paper, hunchback in mockery, through the loud zoo of the willow groves, dodging the parkkeeper with his stick that picks up leaves.
And the old dog sleeper, alone between nurses and swans, while the boys among willows made the tigers jump out of their eyes to roar on the rockery stones, and the groves were blue with sailors.
Made all day until bell time, a woman figure without fault, straight as a young elm, straight and tall from his crooked bones, that she might stand in the night after the locks and chains.
All night in the unmade park, after the railings and shrubberies, the birds, the grass, the trees, the lake, and the wild boys, innocent as strawberries, had followed the hunchback to his kennel in the dark.
The hunchback in the park. The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister.
Welcome back to the Dylan Thomas Centre, where we are joined by the author, Alan Gibbard. How have you been inspired by Dylan Thomas?
I first really fell in love with Dylan Thomas's work when I was in school, because at that time we were studying it for my English A-level, and I loved what I was reading. I had a brilliant teacher who made the whole thing come alive, and what I liked was the way that Dylan plays with words. He likes putting words together in sentences just because they sound nice. Sometimes you're not quite sure what the meaning is, but it sounds really good. It's very, very beautiful, and you can hear the influence of Welsh on him, even though he was writing in English, because the pattern and the sounds of the lines in his poetry were really, really attractive. So that's where it all started.
Sounds like you enjoyed your A-levels then.
You're absolutely right, I did, and I got it as well.
What's your favourite Dylan Thomas poem?
There are so many poems that I really like. I think it's down to a handful of favourites, and it varies according to the time of the year that you're reading them, maybe, or where you're at yourself at that time. But I think if I was to choose one at the moment, it would be Fern Hill. I haven't memorised it, even though my A-levels were years ago and I've had time to memorise it. But when you something like, now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house and happy as the grass was green, that immediately takes you into childhood, a lovely country setting, and it takes you right in, and then throughout the rest of the poem, which I won't read for you now because you probably run out of room for your programme, he talks about childhood memories and about childhood and about life, and I think it's really lovely and powerful.
Should give that a read. How do you think the work of Dylan Thomas can inspire children to start writing?
I think the work of Dylan can inspire young people of any age, and people of any age, but young people particularly, to write just by listening to the sounds that it makes and learn how words can sound next to each other. Learn to play with words. Learn to enjoy experimenting with words. Here in the Dylan Thomas Centre, I know there's a board in the exhibition there with lots of individual magnetic words that you can put together in your order. Well, that's a good exercise to do because that's what Dylan did. Not with a magnetic boards because they didn't exist, but he used to write words. He used to write for hours and hours and hours, just playing around with words and the sounds that words made and putting meanings together as well. And we can all do that.
Okay, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So we are thrilled to interview Professor Daniel Williams, a lecturer at Swansea University and Dylan Thomas enthusiast. We have had the pleasure to interview him about the famous poet Dylan Thomas.
Why do you think it's so important for people to know and learn about Dylan Thomas?
Well, good question. I mean, he's one of the great writers of the 20th century, right? That's thinking about English language literature in the world. What's striking about Dylan Thomas is his use of language, his use of imagery, his knowledge of the English tradition, and his experimentation with it. He emerges in the 1930s and is a very distinctive and original voice in the 1930s. I don't know if you have read about the depression or the slump. You know, the 30s is a period of poverty very much in Britain and in South Wales in particular. And a lot of the poetry emerging in that period is overtly political in some ways, about social conditions. Well, Dylan writes a very different kind of poetry. It's imagistic, metaphoric. He's drawing on the surrealist movement, which has to do more with the way in which we see the world, the way the mind works, more than perhaps what actually is being seen. And his attitude to language is a bit different as well. He treats language as if it's an object. He's interested in the sound of language and the way that language looks. Language for Thomas is almost like Play-Doh, it's something you play with. He talks about meaning coming out of language. So instead of having a big idea that was then transposed into poetry, he'd start with the language itself and the sounds of language. Now you guys go to a Welsh language school, and we could trace that to the Welsh language tradition that of course his parents spoke, because he was used to the sound of Welsh, and the sound of cynganedd, you know, the traditional form of Welsh writing is very much a writing that has to do with the sound of words and the material nature of words. So for us, Dylan is important because actually he's a bridge between Welsh-speaking and English-speaking words. So globally he's significant, but also for us in Wales and Welsh culture he's a significant voice as well.
What do you think is the thing that makes Dylan Thomas's poetry so popular and great to read?
Well, it's partly the originality of it. Is he a popular poet? That's an interesting question, because when you ask people about what they know of Dylan Thomas, it tends to be maybe Under Milkwood or the short stories. It's the later work, post-Second World War work, where he's writing in a slightly more direct, popular kind of mode. His early poetry is very difficult, knotty, hard to pin him down to any specific meaning. People remember maybe Do Not Go Gentle, again a relatively late poet, Fernhill, a late poem. So the early poetry, I'm not sure is that popular, but it had a huge impact, and people of course then go back to look at the poetry having encountered Under Milkwood or Return Journey as some of the more popular pieces, and find them remarkable. Maybe part of the popularity, again thinking in international terms, is that they're kind of universal. You know, that it doesn't seem to be speaking about a particular experience. He seems to be speaking about the human experience as a whole. So it's not alienating in that way. But of course, when you then approach it as a Welsh reader and a Welsh speaker, and someone's visited the house, you can actually see aspects of Welsh culture and the poetry popping up in different places as well. So it's this combination perhaps of the particular voice coming out of Swansea and this sort of global reputation, and it's the tension between the particular and the more universal that makes Dylan popular.
The wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night.
Do you think it's important for the legacy of Dylan Thomas to live on? If so, why?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in the case of any writer, it's important that their legacy lives on. I mean, there are lots of possible answers to that. I suppose, firstly, he's one of the great masters of the English language, right? Our ability to speak, to think, to express is essential to the human experience. And that's why studying English literature is the best thing you can do at university, because you're actually dealing with the greatest minds, expressing themselves at the sort of highest level of thought, right? Literature encompasses everything. And it's not something to be hidden away or thought of as an academic practice. It's about life itself. So just at that level, right? But for us, of course, Dylan is a significant Welsh voice. I come back to this, an absolutely key voice for thinking about Welsh culture, promoting Welsh culture, locating Wales in the world. You know, it's not a provincial thing. Dylan takes us out to the world. He becomes huge, for instance, in America. He goes to America 4 times between 1950 and 1953, the last trip being the fateful trip. He dies in New York, so there's a connection between Dylan and America, and he's arguably, of all British poets in the 20th century, the one who has the biggest impact on American poetry. So the next generation of poets in the 1950s, who you might encounter later on in your reading in school, the beat poets, people like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, and the beginning of a counterculture, radical poets experimenting, and they all look back. Some of them heard Dylan read. Dylan's readings, his recorded, has a big impact in the United States and actually brings the popularity of poetry being read to new audiences. Dylan revives actually that whole tradition, which had largely died out in the early 20th century. So, you know, he just is a hugely significant figure in thinking about English language poetry, and then he's been very widely translated, so his impact then on other literatures is immense. We'd have to know the other languages, but thinking of the other language we do speak, which is the Welsh language, well, although he was writing in English, Dylan had a big impact on Welsh language writers. So someone like Euros Bowen, check out Euros Bowen's work in Welsh. It's very hard to imagine Euros Bowen writing the way he does without the impact of Dylan Thomas on him. Pennar Davies, another one. And even today, people like Men Elfyn, you know, his influence actually does transcend across cultures as well.
Since you know so much about Dylan Thomas, which of his poems is your favourite and why?
Oh, well, let's pick one of the more difficult ones. In the early poetry, there's a poem called A Grief Ago, and I think that's my favourite Dylan Thomas poem. It's very difficult, and you have to try and unpack it. There are lines in it that actually combine so many influences. There's one where he talks about the rod of Sharon. I can't remember exactly the phraseology of it, but it refers to the rose of Sharon, which is Trosin Saron in Angrafis's hymns. Hymns are an influence on Dylan, an element of his writing that isn't completely registered. It refers to Aaron's rod in Exodus in the Bible, and A Grief Ago has something to do with that story. You know, Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt. That's one of the themes in a Grief Ago. And that line also includes a reference to Arianrhod in the Mabinogion, who gives birth to Dylan. Dylan Eildon. So his name comes from the Mabinogion. He's aware of that. So he plays in A Grief Ago with all these influences: Welsh hymnology, the Bible, the Welsh mythic tradition, and that's why I like that poem. And A Grief Ago, it's the typical Dylan Thomas title, because it's not quite anything that would be said, although we kind of know what he means. You know, it's the loss of the past. It has something to do with hiraeth, if you like, or with some disjunction between the poetic voice today and what happened in the past and in terms of its culture that is the source of the grief in the poem. So check that poem out, see what you make of it. There isn't one reading, no one knows what that poem is about, right? And I wouldn't claim to, but you can tease out these different meanings and you see the range of, well, the range of his reading and the range of influences. He's almost like a funnel, Dylan Thomas. A lot of great writers are, you know, they're able to channel all these influences that circulate around them and bring them to a kind of distillation or a powerful expression of all these forces that have influenced them. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your questions.
I'm Sean.
I'm Adam.
YOLO.
Ellis.
Charlie.
And we've got you some few questions to ask.
My son's name's, I was going to say my son's name's Charlie. Oh. I was just going to say my son's name's Charlie and his surname's Ellis, so it's...
The first question is, what's your favourite Dylan Thomas poem?
My favourite poem, I'm not sure if it's one you know, but it's called The Force That Through the Green Stripes a Flower. It's very complicated, but I like it because my grandfather wrote it when he was 18, so he was really quite young. And it's all about creation, destruction, and it's just one that timed me with me, really.
Okay, your next question is, Thomas described Swansea as an ugly, lovely town. How do you think Dylan Thomas really thought what do you think his real thoughts were on Swansea?
I think his feelings were mixed. Can you hear me all right, or am I jumping about?
No, you're fine.
Yeah. I think his feelings were probably a bit mixed. I think he loved places. He liked Donkey Park, Silly, Workhead, all sorts of places. So he liked the locations. But I think some of the uglier bits he liked. During the 1930s, there was a big depression, and there was a lot of poor people around, and I don't think he liked seeing people in rags and having much money, and the inequalities, really. So I think that's why he called it his lovely uglies. He loved the looked, but he didn't like sometimes the inequalities, the unfairness of life.
Thank you. What do you think your grandfather's greatest legacy is?
Yeah, my point is that he said to some people just before he died that they should love the words. And I think that's the legacy. I think the fact that he didn't have any rules when it came to writing. He broke all the rules. You know, you're told you have to do things with rhymes and in a certain way. He broke all of that. He did it all in his own way. And he just said, you've just got to love it. Doesn't matter what other people say, you do it the way you want to. And that's, I think, the greatest legacy.
If there were 3 things you wanted the children of Swansea to learn about your grandfather, what would they be?
I think the first thing would be, I would like children to realise that actually my grandfather was really young when he wrote. So he died at 39, so everything he did, he was before he was 39. But most of the poetry he wrote, 2/3 of it, I think, before he was 20. So he was a teenager. So most of his work he did was when he was a teenager. So he was not much older than you. So, and he had the same worries, the same fears, the same hopes. And he was in Swansea as well, very much like you. The other thing I'd like children of Swansea to know is that he created a bit of a character for himself. You may have heard about this Dylan Thomas, who was a bit of a rebel and was a bit crazy and things. He sort of invented that a bit. He wasn't really like that. That was an idea he wanted people to believe him to be. And people have carried on thinking that even after he died. So his acting worked, really. But he was a bit more sensitive, a bit shyer, and actually a bit of an introvert. So he was very different, the character he portrayed. And I'd also like the children of Swansea to know that in the 1950s and 60s, after he died, there were musicians like John Lennon and Paul McCartney, Bob Dylan, quite well-known musicians, absolutely loved his work. They thought it was brilliant, and because musicians are poets, really, aren't they? So yeah, so he was very popular with young people in the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you.
How has your grandfather influenced your career?
Not initially. I used to be a primary school teacher, so I used to work with children a bit younger than you, and I was busy doing that. And then my life changed about 9 years ago. My mum died, and she used to run with the estate and everything to do with Dylan Thomas, and I took that over. So now that's very much part of that's what I do. I promote Dylan Thomas, I do a lot about his work, I go around promoting him. Really, I'm just trying to spread the message for people to love the words, really. And another way he's influenced me is actually I write stories for very young children, sort of 3 to 5 year olds, and so that's probably where I've influenced it.
The next question is, where's the most interesting place you visited because of your grandfather?
Well, I've got to go to Buckingham Palace. I got invited to Prince Charles's house in Carmarthenshire, and they are huge. And the paintings are bigger than me. Honestly, they're huge. And I said to the Queen, I said, "Oh, I like your brooch." And she looked down. I don't even realise she's wearing a brooch. And another place that I really liked was New York. That was fantastic. But again, the building was huge. It was just, there were so many taxis. It was mad. It was wild. It was completely different, the opposite sort of thing. But really, the most interesting parts for me, I think, were, have you been to Ysgol Gyfun Drive, where Dylan was born?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah. Have you been there? Yeah. That was really interesting when I went with my little boy, because I stood in there and I thought, you know what? 6 generations of my family have been here. So so my little tiny tot of a son to great grandparents, and we've all stood in that same room at some point in our lives, and that gave me a bit of a chill. So yeah, that's really interesting.
The last question is your occupation anything to do with poetry?
My specialist bits are English and drama, so I used to teach that. So yes, so I did a lot of teaching poetry. But now I work up with bits. I work in the arts. I go around getting people to love the words, to write and have fun. And so yeah, I work a lot with different poets and different poets from different parts of the world. But I'm not a poet. I'm definitely not a poet.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
See you in the near future.
Yes, in the future. Take care. Bye. Good luck with your project.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I look forward to seeing the film when it's done.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Bye.